The text came as the mountains were just catching their first light. My coffee was still too hot to drink, steam fogging my glasses when I looked down at the screen. The terrace flagstones held a slick sheen of frost, and the only sound was the faint tick of cooling iron from the patio heater I'd forgotten to turn off. I remember how the gold line on the ridge turned orange, then crimson, as if the day itself were taking a breath. 5 words glowed in a gray bubble. This year, just your sister. My thumb hovered over the phone as the heat left my cup and collected in my chest. For a moment, it felt like I'd been tapped lightly on the shoulder, and then pushed hard in the same place that never quite healed. I typed one word back, "Enjoy," and set the phone face down, the clink against the table louder than it should have been. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, hit that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. But to understand how one small message could open a lifetime's worth of cracks, you need to know where those cracks began. I grew up learning how to smile from the edges. At our old oak kitchen table, there was a seat that faced the back window, and that seat belonged to Catherine from the day she could climb onto it. My mother said the light there was so flattering for photographs, and her camera always seemed to be in her hand. I learned early to lean out of the frame, scooting my chair, clearing plates, fixing the porch light that buzzed and blinked whenever it rained. I liked fixing things. They made sense. You tightened a screw, the world behaved. My mother, Margaret, was not a cruel woman. She was a careful one. Her compliments came like postage stamps, small, adhesive, and always placed exactly where she wanted them to go. Catherine, 3 years younger, collected them in tidy rows. I was given plain envelopes, practical, responsible, self-sufficient. My father, David, worked long hours and kept peace by keeping quiet. If Catherine had a dance recital, he brought flowers. When I had a science fair, he brought the car around. At 16, I waited outside the gym after volleyball practice while a long, steady rain turned the parking lot into almond-colored glass. My bag grew heavy on my shoulder as the team trickled away. An hour later, I walked the 3 miles home and stood dripping on the porch while the porch light hummed and the television inside laughed. My mother opened the door with that distracted smile. Mascara, neat hair, neat voice, neat. "Sweetheart, Catherine's recital ran long," she said. "We'll celebrate this weekend." We never did. The rain dried from the foyer rug, and I learned there was always something more pressing than me. 2 summers later, I graduated at the top of my class. The stage lights were warm, and the gym smelled faintly of floor polish and carnations. The metal chairs clattered and filled. I stared at 3 empty ones in the family section and told myself that empty chairs are still chairs. By the time the ceremony ended, my phone held a message. "Catherine has a terrible cold. Dad stayed with her. We're so proud of you." I smiled for a photo with my guidance counselor, the one adult who looked at me like the air itself wasn't apologizing. People like to say college is where you find yourself. I found a language that would finally answer when I spoke to it. In computer science, nothing cared about the flattering light. Code didn't look over my shoulder to see who stood behind me. It reacted to inputs. It rewarded patience. It respected clarity. I worked nights in the computer lab with vending machine coffee and a librarian's hush, stringing logic together like beads until the pattern held. I wasn't the funniest, or the prettiest, or the loudest, but I could make things run, and that felt like standing in sunlight that belonged to no one. I left with a degree and a quiet certainty that my future would be built with my own 2 hands. There were job offers, handsome ones, but I said no. A small group of us rented a cramped workspace above a printing shop and founded a company that patched holes in digital fences. We slept badly, ate worse, and spent entire days chasing a bug down a dark hallway until it turned and showed us its face. I called home sometimes. My mother would say, "How's your little computer job?" with a brightness that squeaked. Catherine would cycle through New Passion's photography pottery, a theater class that needed $2,000 for materials. My father would ask if I was being careful. I always was. What I never said into the receiver was that scarcity was a teacher I understood better than most. When all your life you've been the footnote, you learn how to stretch things, time, money, patience. You learn to keep receipts the way others keep diaries. You learn to say, "I'm fine," and mean it. And you learn to tuck your need for applause into a deep pocket and forget the shape of it. Years later, everything changed in a conference room with soft carpet and hard edges. We had built a wall no one could get through, and someone important noticed. Numbers were named, papers were signed, and the strange quiet that follows triumph settled over me like snowfall. The bank account filled. The room didn't. I told almost no one. I kept the apartment that looked out on a narrow street where the trash truck rumbled every Thursday at dawn. I drove my old Honda, changed my own oil, clicked off a lamp instead of the switch because the switch sometimes stuck. Independence isn't a performance when you've practiced it your whole life. It's breathing. What I did tell no one in my family, not even in hints, was that on a road trip through Vermont in late September, I pulled onto a gravel shoulder and looked up a hill at a brick house with a long front lawn and a maple that arched like a cathedral. The place had good bones. The shutters needed paint. The front steps had a hairline crack that would widen with the first hard freeze. I stood at the gate, wind on my face, and felt something steady in my ribs. I wrote a number on a piece of paper. The door opened to me. I called it Maple Hill because there are names that feel like they've been waiting for you. The house sighed. Floors complained when you crossed them. The library smelled of old glue and lemon oil. I fixed what needed fixing and kept what shouldn't be tamed. A slate roof, thick glass that held the cold like a memory. A barn that would one day echo. In the mornings, I drank coffee on the terrace and watched the ridge take light like a blessing. In the evenings, I built fires and let the day burn down to coals. There was room here, room for gatherings I had never had, for conversations that didn't edge around a single chair by a back window. Even then, I kept the details to myself. Secrecy wasn't about playing princess in a tower. It was the only way I knew to measure love without a calculator. Would anyone ask about my life without asking what they could borrow? Would my mother look at me and see a person, not a purse? Would Catherine send a photo of her latest painting without a link to her crowdfunding page? Privacy was my experiment and my shield. The Thanksgiving. Before it all broke open, Catherine announced an engagement 3 months in a ring that flashed more than it shone. The whole day tipped toward her like a table with short legs. When I asked about a budget, my mother pressed her lips into a smile. Not everyone is obsessed with money, Jody. I had paid for their anniversary trip that summer without signing my name to it. I carved turkey. I washed pans. I left with foil-wrapped leftovers I didn't want, and a familiar throb in the place that marks time. And then came the text. This year, just your sister. My mother has always favored efficiency. 5 words cost less than a conversation. I don't know if she imagined I'd be relieved. I don't know if Catherine sat next to her with the good light on that couch and nodded. I do know that something cold and clean moved through me as I read it. Not a scream, not a sob, more like a click, the sound a well-made lock makes before the bolt slides home. I stood and carried my coffee to the terrace rail. The mug warmed my fingers while the wind pinched the tips. Down in the field, the grass lay silvered, every blade holding onto its own small frost. A crow cut across the valley, black against all that light, its wings beating. I thought of the empty chairs at my graduation. I thought of wet shoelaces on the porch mat of a cake that was always going to be baked this weekend of polite questions about a little computer job and the way pride arrived last, if it arrived at all. I thought of the house behind me of book spines standing to attention of a room big enough for 24 chairs, all of them waiting. The phone buzzed again on the table. It was quiet in that steady way only old houses know. The porch light was off because the morning didn't need it. Somewhere inside, the furnace exhaled soft and even. I picked the phone up and read the message one more time, as if repetition could change the shape of what it said. This year, just your sister. There is a reflex I have honed for years, something like folding a map along the crease it's been folded along since before you owned it. You follow the same line. You put it away, you find your keys, you go. I felt my hands wanting that familiar motion. I felt the apology rising the explanation I would craft for their convenience. I could already hear myself saying, "No worries. I'm busy anyway." The sentence tried to step out of my mouth, put on its shoes, and leave. Instead, I set the phone down again, exactly centered on the table's slat. I flattened my palm on the cool wood until my fingers tingled and watched the ridge change from crimson to daylight, the color draining like a bruise that would take its time to heal. Somewhere, a delivery truck rumbled on the road below. A pair of deer eased from the pines and stood ears high as if listening for a direction I couldn't hear. My reply, "Enjoy," sat like a pebble at the bottom of a clear glass. Small, ordinary, undeniable. I wiped the ring of coffee from the table with the edge of my sleeve. The fabric went dark where it touched the moisture, then slowly lightened again. In the kitchen, a clock I rarely noticed chimed the half hour. The sound walked through the rooms and out onto the terrace where I stood. People think injustice is always loud. Sometimes it is the quietest thing you'll ever hear. I took my cup to the sink and rinsed it under water that ran just short of hot. The faucet squeaked. I made a note to fix it. I dried the mug and placed it in the cabinet rim, pointing forward the way I always do. My hands were steady. My breath was too. I told myself I would go upstairs and make the bed, that I would answer 2 emails and lace my shoes and run the gravel road to the old stone bridge where the river carries the cold like it's proud of it. I told myself I would move. Instead, I stood with both palms on the edge of the counter and listened to the house settle around me. A chill crept along the tile and into my bare feet. Somewhere, a door shifted in its frame. My phone face down again didn't buzz. There were no footsteps, no voices, no chair scraping back to make room. Out beyond the terrace, the sun climbed and made the frost let go. Droplets formed and fell soft as breathing. I watched the first one slide from the rail and drop out of sight. I didn't follow it. In that stillness, the one you get between insult and reply, between being told who you are and deciding for yourself, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not anger. Not yet. Just the weight of the ledger as it finally balanced column by column, all the numbers I'd kept in my head lining up without me pressing them into place. When the clock marked noon, I was still there, the house holding its breath with me. The day was bright now, all gloss and glare, the kind of sky that makes the edges of everything sharper. I lifted the phone at last and set it next to the fruit bowl where it would be easy to ignore. Then I turned, walked to the hallway, and opened the door to the library. Dust danced in the slant of light. The leather chair by the fireplace looked like a held-out hand. On the desk lay a pen uncapped from last night when I had written a grocery list and then crossed everything off because really, what did I need? I stood there for a long minute, not moving, listening again for the thing that had shifted. It wasn't furniture. It wasn't weather. It was quieter than that and older. The house was still when I finally moved from the doorway. The air had that winter crispness that seeps into old wood, and the quiet was heavy enough to hear the tick of the baseboard heater behind the wall. Outside, the frost had melted into fine mist, rising like breath from the ground. I walked back to the terrace and looked over the valley. The maples stood bare now, their leaves gone, their branches etched like veins against the sky. The beauty of it didn't soothe me. It only made the silence feel wider. I had spent so many years believing silence meant peace. But that morning, it carried weight. Every creak of the house, every distant crow felt like a reminder that there was no one left to expect at my table. No mother, no father, no sister arriving late with apologies that never held. The text had done something I hadn't managed to do myself. It had closed the door for me. Still, habits die hard. I set a second cup of coffee on the counter without thinking, then poured it out before it cooled. My hands worked on autopilot, straightening chairs, folding the throw on the couch. My mind kept circling the same thought, 35 years old, and still waiting for someone to treat me like family. I went to my study, opened my laptop, and stared at the blank calendar on the screen. Thanksgiving, once the hardest day of the year, was now just a Thursday. My inbox was full of promotional emails, recipes, travel discounts, reminders to be grateful. The words blurred together until I shut the lid. Gratitude wasn't what I felt. Not yet. When the phone rang, the sound startled me. The name on the screen read, Sophie. I didn't hesitate. Her voice came through warm and concerned, the kind of tone that finds the crack in your calm. "You sound off," she said. "What happened?" I told her about the message. Just the facts at first, but my voice thinned halfway through. I could hear her take a breath on the other end, slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to shout. "After everything you've done for them," she said quietly. "After every year you've shown up." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. "I think I'm done trying." Her answer was immediate. "Good. You've earned the right to stop." We were silent for a moment. Then she said, "Come to us for Thanksgiving. Brad and the kids would love it." Her offer was kind, but it felt like stepping into someone else's family photo. "Thank you," I said. "But maybe I'll stay here this time." "Then make it yours," Sophie replied. "Do something that feels like you." After we hung up, her words stayed with me. Do something that feels like you. I walked through the rooms, touching the corners of tables, the edges of door frames, thinking about how many hours I'd spent building this sanctuary and how few people had ever stepped inside. Maybe it was time that changed. By noon, an idea had begun to take shape, not out of spite, but out of need. If my family didn't have room for me at their table, I would make one of my own. A table big enough for the people who had been kind in small ways, the ones who had shown up without expectation. I didn't know who all that would be yet, but I knew it was time. I made a list. It began with Sophie and Brad, then stretched outward friends from college, a few neighbors from town, my Uncle James in Boston, Aunt Lillian down in Connecticut, people who had once been part of my life before my parents started pruning the family tree down to the immediate four of us. Each name I added felt like opening a window. I drafted the invitation on my computer. The words came naturally. Thanksgiving at Maple Hill Estate, a celebration of gratitude and new beginnings. I paused, reading it aloud. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. The next day, I sent the invitations. Most went by email, a few required actual phone calls. One by one, responses began to appear, warm, curious, surprised. Many said they'd rearrange plans to come. By the end of the week, the number had climbed to nearly 50. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. I hired a local event planner named Diane Marshall to help coordinate everything. She was in her 50s, brisk but kind, the type who called everyone hun. When she walked through the house with her clipboard, she nodded in approval. "You've got a good canvas here," she said. "We'll make it shine." The following days unfolded like a rhythm. I hadn't realized I missed lists, deliveries, calls from vendors. The house filled with movement and purpose. Electricians hung strings of warm lights in the barn. A florist draped garlands of maple leaves along the railings. The kitchen buzzed with the sound of pots and pans as the hired chef, Eleanor, tested recipes using local produce. Each morning, I walked the property before the crew arrived. The air was cold enough to bite, but it cleared my head. I thought about the dinners of my childhood long tables that revolved around Catherine's laughter and my mother's corrections. There had been no warmth, only performance. This would be different. When Sophie arrived a few days before Thanksgiving, her first words were, "Jody, this place looks like a movie." She stood in the doorway, taking in the high ceilings, the soft light falling across the floors. "You really did it," she said. "I guess I did." We spent that evening by the fireplace, sorting name cards and laughing about how long it had been since either of us had hosted anything. Brad joined later, carrying a bottle of bourbon. "You sure you're ready for 50 people?" he asked with a smile. "I'm not sure at all," I said, "but I think it's time to stop being invisible." He nodded. "That's as good a reason as any." By the night before Thanksgiving, the estate felt alive. The dining hall gleamed with candles and crystal. The barn glowed under strands of gold light, the smell of roasted maple and wood smoke hanging in the air. I walked through the rooms one last time, checking every detail. The fireplaces laid the linen smooth, the music playlist cued. Sophie followed behind me barefoot, a glass of wine in her hand. "This is more than a dinner," she said softly. "This is you finally opening the door." I didn't answer, but she was right. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a thin layer of snow on the grass, the kind that sparkled before melting. The mountains beyond the valley were pale blue, and the sky so clear it looked almost new. By 11, cars began winding up the drive. I stood in the foyer, hands slightly trembling as the first guests arrived. Uncle James stepped through the door first, his wife close behind. "Good Lord, Jody," he said, looking around. "When you said Vermont, I pictured a cabin, not a manor." His laughter was genuine, and it loosened something in me. "Just call it home," I said. "Coffee's ready in the great room." Soon the house was humming. Conversations overlapped, children darted through hallways, fireplaces crackled in unison. The air carried the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon, and for the first time the sound of joy in this house wasn't imagined. At 2, I stood by the stone fireplace to welcome everyone. The words came easily. "Thank you for being here," I began. "For years, I've kept this part of my life private, my work, my home, my success. But today, I wanted to share it with the people who've mattered to me along the way." I paused, looking at the faces gathered. This is a celebration of gratitude, yes, but also of new beginnings. Consider yourselves family here. Applause followed, soft but sincere. Someone raised a glass, and laughter filled the room again. The day unfolded in warmth and music, the kind that runs under the skin. Later, as dusk painted the hills, I slipped out onto the terrace. The lights from inside glowed through the windows, golden against the snow. From where I stood, the voices drifted faintly. Eleanor laughing in the kitchen, Sophie calling the kids in from the cold. I felt a quiet I hadn't felt before, the kind that doesn't sting. My phone buzzed on the railing beside me. The screen lit with a name I hadn't seen since that morning 2 weeks ago. Mom. I let it ring once, twice, and fade. Then another message appeared, shorter this time. "We missed you today." I watched the light from the screen fade back to black. Inside, someone started playing the piano soft, steady notes that carried through the glass. I turned from the phone and walked back inside. In the great room, Sophie caught my eye. "You okay?" she mouthed. I nodded. "Perfect," I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. For the rest of the night, I let the music and laughter wrap around me. Every face I saw reflected something real: kindness, joy, belonging. For once, I didn't feel like the afterthought in my own story. When the guests began to leave, I stood by the door, thanking each one. Uncle James pressed my hand and said, "Your mother would be proud." I smiled, but didn't answer. Pride had to be earned, and I was no longer in the business of chasing it. After the last car lights disappeared down the drive, I walked back inside. The rooms were still again the way they had been that morning 2 weeks ago, but they felt different now. Not empty, just waiting. I turned off the last of the lights and stood for a moment in the doorway of the dining room. The candles had burned low and the scent of pine still lingered in the air. My phone, forgotten on the mantel, vibrated once more in the dark. I didn't reach for it. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. I watched it drift through the glow of the porch light, each flake settling like a promise on the steps below. Tomorrow, there would be messages to answer and decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for anyone's invitation. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house felt strangely light. The air was cold and clean, and the faint scent of cinnamon still lingered from the night before. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching the last embers in the fireplace fade to ash. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ache. It hums softly, like a secret well kept. The estate had been full the night before laughter. In every room, voices echoing down hallways I'd once walked alone. Now the stillness was a kind of grace. Outside, snow glistened on the lawn, thin as lace. Sophie's children were the first to stir. Their laughter carried from the guest cottage where they were staying. It made me smile. I poured coffee into a mug, the one with the small chip on the rim, and leaned against the counter. My phone sat beside the coffee maker, silent for once. Then it buzzed once, then again, steady, insistent. The name that flashed across the screen pulled me upright. My mother. I hesitated before opening the message. "What is this house I'm hearing about?" it read. "Aunt Lillian just called asking if we enjoyed your Thanksgiving party. What are you doing?" "Jody," I read it twice, then placed the phone face down. Another buzz followed Catherine this time. "Mom's freaking out. James Jr. showed her pictures of your mansion. What's going on?" "Since when do you have money?" I stared at the phone for a long moment before sliding it across the counter. The heat from the mug bled into my palms. It should have felt satisfying, this sudden reversal. Years of being dismissed now turned into disbelief. But the hollow ache returned instead. I had hoped to stop caring. Somehow, I still did. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Brad stood there in a heavy coat, cheeks red from the cold. "Snow's starting again," he said. "We're thinking of taking the kids into town for Coco. You coming?" "Maybe later," I said. "I've got a few things to handle first." He studied my face. "Family found the photos," I nodded. He gave a low whistle. "Brace yourself then. I've seen that look before, the one where people realize they misjudge someone and don't know how to say it." He smiled softly, trying to make it light. "If you need backup, we're here." When he left, I finally picked up the phone. More messages weighted my mother's tone, shifting from curiosity to accusation. My father's voicemail sounded confused, gentle, as if he was asking about a missing key rather than a daughter. Catherine's texts turned from defensive to pleading. The rhythm of their words was painfully familiar. You owe us an explanation. We're worried. It's not what you think. I set the phone aside and walked out to the terrace. The valley stretched below me, silver and white under the afternoon light. A thin mist rolled through the pines, curling between the branches. Somewhere deep in the woods, a bird called long and low. The stillness steadied me. For once, I didn't need to rush toward their demands. They had made me wait all my life. They could wait a little longer. By evening, the messages turned frantic. My mother called every half hour. Catherine's tone softened into apology. I'm sorry about Thanksgiving, one read. It was my fault. I wanted Mom's full attention for wedding plans. I didn't think you'd care. The words sat heavy in my chest. She had thought she was asking for love, but what she'd taken was mine. Sophie noticed my distraction at dinner. They're calling, aren't they? She asked quietly, passing me the bread basket. I nodded. They can wait, she said. Let them sit with it for a while. You've earned your peace. I wanted to believe her, yet as the night deepened and the house fell into soft sleep, the questions kept returning. What would I say when I finally answered? How do you speak to people who have only known you small? By Sunday evening, the snow had thickened. Guests were packing cars, idling in the driveway, the farewells warm and lingering. When the last taillight disappeared down the hill, I stood by the front door and exhaled. The quiet settled again, this time heavier, the kind that waits for a choice to be made. I turned off the porch light and went to my study. The phone lay on the desk screen, lighting the room with soft pulses. The newest message was from my mother. Please call. We're worried about you. The one before that, you owe us nothing, but we want to understand. I scrolled back through them all, through Catherine's apologies and my father's gentle confusion. Then I opened a blank text window and typed, I'll call tomorrow at noon. Please have Catherine there too. I pressed send before I could change my mind. The next day, the snow had turned to soft rain. It whispered against the windows while I prepared the call. I built a fire in the study not for warmth, but to steady my nerves. At noon, I set up the laptop on the desk, the camera angled toward the shelves behind me. When the call connected, my mother's face filled the screen first, her expression tight. Catherine sat beside her, pale mascara smudged. My father hovered behind them, hands on his knees. Jody, can you hear us? My mother asked. I can. My voice sounded even. Hello, Mother. Catherine. Dad. They looked around, taking in the glimpse of my study, the stone fireplace, the polished wood. My mother's mouth pressed into a line. Is that where you live now? Yes, Maple Hill Estate. I've owned it for 4 years. Her eyes narrowed. 4 years? And you never told us. How could you keep something like this secret? I had known that would be her first question, the instinct to find offense before understanding. Before we talk about what I haven't told you, I said quietly, let's talk about what you didn't tell me, like the fact that I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving. My mother blinked. That's not fair. We thought you'd be busy with work. Catherine needed time to discuss the wedding. If that was true, you could have asked, I said. You could have said something more than a 5-word text. Catherine shifted, looking down. It was my idea, she said finally. I was stressed. I wanted Mom's help, and I thought you'd be fine skipping 1 year. You always seemed so together. Everyone assumes that I replied, but no one ever asks. My father leaned forward, his voice tentative. What's all this about Jody? The money, the house. Are you in some kind of trouble? The question almost made me laugh. No, Dad. Not trouble. Success. Remember that little company I started after college? The one you said was a phase? He frowned. Of course. It was acquired by Nexus Technologies 4 years ago. For $27 million. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. My mother's mouth fell open. Catherine's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. My father just blinked, processing the number like it was in a foreign language. 27 million, he repeated slowly. Why didn't you tell us? Because I wanted to know if you'd love me without it, I said. I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval. I thought maybe without money in the picture I could finally find out if you saw me as more than an afterthought. My mother's jaw tightened. So this was some kind of test. You deliberately deceived us? No, I said softly. It was self-preservation. You've spent years overlooking me. I just stopped expecting it to change. Catherine's voice cracked when she spoke. I didn't know you felt that way. I thought you didn't need us. Everyone needs family, I said. But family should feel like a place you can rest, not one where you're always defending your worth. For a moment, the fire popped, and no one spoke. My father rubbed his forehead. Well, this changes everything, he said finally. With that kind of money, you could help Catherine with her wedding, help us with the second mortgage. The sadness hit sharper than anger. I looked at him and shook my head. That's exactly why I kept it private. You didn't hear a word I said. My mother's tone softened. We made mistakes, she said quietly. But we're still your family. We should be able to work through this. Maybe, I said, but not on the old terms. I'm not interested in being useful to be loved. I'm asking for respect, for honesty. The silence that followed stretched long. My mother looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she spoke again, her voice was small. Would you consider having us visit maybe for Christmas? We'd like to see where you live. It was the first time I'd ever heard her ask instead of demand. I considered it carefully. I'll think about it, I said. But if you come, it will be as guests, not as people entitled to my life. Catherine leaned closer to the screen. Please, Jody, give us a chance to do better. I was jealous of you, if I'm honest. You always seemed free. Her words caught me off guard, softening something I didn't realize was still tender. I'll let you know in a week, I said quietly. That's all I can promise. When the call ended, I sat for a long while watching the flames die down. The room smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a thin beam of sunlight pressed through the clouds, laying a pale gold line across the desk. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. For years, I had waited for them to see me. Now they finally had, but not in the way I once imagined. The truth was no longer hidden, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their expectations fall away. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and the exhaustion, there was a quiet clarity. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation or distance, it would be on my terms. I rose from the chair and opened the window. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke. The world below the hill was still. In that moment, I realized I wasn't angry anymore, just ready. Snow came again the following week, a steady curtain that softened the hills and muted the world to a hush. I woke early each morning, walked through the quiet halls, and thought about what had been said on that call. Their faces had stayed with me. My mother's rigid poise cracking around the edges. Catherine's tears streaking down mascara. My father's lost stare as he tried to make sense of it all. For the first time, they had listened, but the sound of their silence afterward was louder than anything. By the fifth morning, the decision had taken shape. I texted my mother to say I'd thought it over and was willing to host Christmas at Maple Hill on one condition: that they came as guests, not judges. Her reply came within minutes. We'd be honored. Thank you for giving us a chance. When Christmas Eve finally came, the house glowed under fresh snow. Pine garlands curved along the staircase, and the scent of cedar hung in the air. I'd asked Eleanor to prepare a simple warm dinner duck with cherry glaze roasted winter vegetables, wild rice with pecans. Nothing extravagant, but everything chosen with care. The dining room shimmered in candlelight, every flame mirrored in the glass doors that opened to the snowy fields. Their car arrived just after dusk. I watched from the window as it crept up the long drive tires, crunching against the ice. When they stepped out, they looked small against the wide white landscape bundled in heavy coats, faces wary. I opened the door before they reached it. "Welcome to Maple Hill," I said. My voice sounded calm, though my hands were trembling slightly. My mother's eyes moved across the entryway, taking in the chandelier, the polished floors, the sweeping staircase. "It's beautiful," she murmured. My father nodded silently. Catherine trailed behind them, her expression mixed wonder and guilt sharing the same space. "Let me show you your rooms," I said. The air between us felt fragile, as if one wrong word could break it. I led them upstairs, pointing out the guest rooms I'd prepared, the soft throws folded at the foot of each bed, the fresh flowers on the nightstands, small comforts I'd always wished for growing up. After they'd settled, we gathered in the smaller dining room. It was more intimate than the grand hall, a room that felt easier for honesty. The fire snapped softly as we sat. For a while, the conversation was polite weather, the drive a few guarded compliments. My father commented on the craftsmanship of the wood beams. My mother admired the table setting, her voice careful. It was Catherine who finally exhaled the tension. "I never knew you liked hosting," she said, smiling faintly. "This place, it feels like something out of a storybook." I smiled back. "It's home," I said. "I built it to feel that way." Dinner was quiet, but civil. The food grounded us. The warmth of the fire softened the edges. By the time dessert came, a pear tart and hot cider, their shoulders had relaxed. I caught my father looking around the room as though seeing me for the first time, as part of it, not separate from it. After dinner, we moved to the sitting room. The Christmas tree stood by the window, 12 feet tall, strung with white lights and silver ornaments that reflected the firelight. My mother studied it for a long time before speaking. "You did all this yourself with help," I said. "But I chose everything." She nodded slowly. "You've built a beautiful life, Jody." There was no envy in her tone this time, only a quiet astonishment. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind outside whispered against the glass, and I could hear the faint pop of a log settling in the fire. Then Catherine spoke, her voice soft. "I never realized how little I knew about you. You were always the steady one. I thought you didn't need attention like I did." I set my cup down. "I needed it," I said. "I just stopped asking for it." She looked at her hands. "That was unfair of a..." My father cleared his throat. "We should have been there more," he said. "For all of it." His voice caught on the last word. I met his eyes and nodded. "You were doing your best. We all were." My mother looked between us, her eyes glistening. "It doesn't feel like enough," she whispered. "It wasn't," I said gently. "But it can be different now." The fire crackled, filling the pause that followed. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't hurt. It was simply there, waiting. Later that night, after they went to bed, I walked through the quiet house, The tree lights glowed softly against the dark windows, and the snow outside shimmered like powdered glass. I stopped at the base of the stairs, listening to the faint creaks of the floorboards overhead, the kind of sounds that mean a house is full again. Something loosened in my chest. Christmas morning came cold and bright. I rose early, lit the fires, and brewed coffee. One by one they appeared, my father first, then Catherine, still wrapped in her robe, and finally my mother, holding her cup, as if unsure where to sit. We gathered by the tree, the morning light spilling across the floor. The gifts were small but meaningful. For my father, a first edition novel I'd tracked down from a collector in Boston. For my mother, a hand-woven shawl from a Vermont artisan. For Catherine, a professional set of art supplies, the kind she'd always wanted, but never bought. Their surprise was genuine, their thanks unpracticed, but real. When it was their turn, they handed me a small stack of gifts, safe choices, things bought in haste. Gift cards, a framed family photo, a scented candle. I smiled and thanked them anyway. Then I reached for a larger box I'd placed to the side. "This is for all of us," I said, setting it on the coffee table. Inside was a leather-bound album, heavy and worn at the edges. My mother frowned slightly as I opened it to the first page, a photograph of our great-grandparents standing in front of their farmhouse nearly a century ago. "I've been working on this for years," I said, collecting photos, letters, stories from every branch of the family. I wanted to rebuild what time had scattered. Page by page, I turned the album. There were wedding portraits, letters written in careful ink, faded birth certificates, notes scribbled on the backs of old photographs. My mother's hand rose to her mouth as she traced the face of her own mother as a young woman, smiling in a way she hadn't remembered. "Where did you find these?" she asked softly. "I reached out to cousins, historians, even a few museums," I said. They helped me restore what was left. When I reached the final section, the photographs changed my own childhood moments they had forgotten. Me at a spelling bee holding a ribbon. Me on the volleyball court mid-serve. Me at my graduation, the empty seats beside me. The images spoke for themselves. "You kept all this," my mother whispered. "I did," I said. "Because they mattered to me even when they didn't seem to matter to anyone else." Catherine stared at the pages, her eyes filling. "I never saw how lopsided it was," she said quietly. "You were always on the edge of every picture." "It's not about blame," I said. "We all learned our parts early. I learned to disappear. You learned to shine. Mom and Dad did what they knew, but I want to stop repeating it." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold, but steady. "When did you become so wise?" she asked. I smiled faintly when I stopped waiting for permission to be myself. We spent the rest of the morning turning pages, telling stories, filling in the spaces the years had hollowed out. The fire burned low, and sunlight spread through the windows, warming the room. For the first time, I saw something new in my mother's expression. Humility, maybe even regret, softened by love. That afternoon, as they packed to leave, the mood was quiet but different. My mother lingered at the door, her scarf half tied. "This isn't goodbye," she said. "It's a beginning, I hope." "A beginning takes effort," I said gently. "Real effort." "I know," she replied, "and I'll try." Catherine hugged me tightly before stepping outside. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she said. "I don't deserve how kind you've been. Just try to do better," I said. "That's all I ask." I watched their car move slowly down the drive until it disappeared between the trees. The snow fell softly again, covering their tire tracks, as if erasing the past. I closed the door and turned back to the warm, quiet house. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I walked to the window and looked out at the falling snow. Each flake a quiet reminder that change doesn't arrive all at once. It drifts in slowly until the whole world looks different. Snow still lined the stone wall along the drive the next morning, its edges beginning to soften under a weak winter sun. The air was calm and thin, smelling faintly of smoke and pine. I stood by the window, watching a red cardinal hop between branches. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. It breathed with me. After they left, I'd spent hours walking from room to room, touching the places where their presence had lingered, the mug my mother left by the sink, the folded throw. Catherine forgot on the couch, the faint cologne my father wore still caught in the hallway air. Once these traces would have filled me with ache. Now they just felt human. Temporary, imperfect, alive. I poured myself coffee and carried it out to the terrace. The sun sat low, melting the surface of the snow until it glittered like glass. Down in the field, deer tracks curved toward the woods, delicate and precise. There was a kind of peace in that, a pattern forming quietly unseen just by living. A week later, a letter arrived. It was from my mother, handwritten on the same ivory stationery she used for holidays. The handwriting was smaller than usual, more careful. She thanked me for the hospitality, for the patience I had shown, and ended with a single sentence that caught me off guard. I realize now that love isn't proven by control. I read that line twice, then folded the paper neatly and placed it in the drawer beside my desk. It wasn't an apology, not entirely, but it was a beginning. Catherine called a few days later. Her voice was lighter than I'd ever heard it. "I've been painting again," she said. "Real work this time. I even signed up for classes at the community college." "That's good," I said, smiling into the phone. She hesitated. "I'm sorry, Jody. For all the times I made things harder for you. You deserved better." I let her words settle before answering. "We both did," I said softly. "Let's try not to repeat it." In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of my days returned, but everything felt subtly changed. Work calls, the hum of the fireplace, the creak of the stair railing at night, all of it belonged to a quieter version of my life. Not lonely quiet, but chosen quiet. I began hosting small gatherings again, nothing grand. Sunday dinners with neighbors, evenings with Sophie and Brad by the fire. The house had learned laughter, and it didn't echo anymore. Evenings stretched long and warm, full of music and small conversation, the kind that doesn't need to impress anyone. Sometimes I'd catch Sophie watching me across the table, smiling the way people do when they recognize someone who's finally at ease. One night she said, "You've changed. Maybe I've just stopped shrinking," I replied. She raised her glass. "To expansion, then." "To peace," I said. By late February, the snow had melted from the south hill. Mud showed where the grass would soon wake, and the first bluebird nested in the rafters of the old barn. I started walking again, after dinner, down to the edge of the field, where the air smelled of thawing earth. The sky stretched open there wide and forgiving, with streaks of violet and gold blending into night. One evening, I found myself thinking about all the years I'd spent trying to earn what should have been freely given. The moments of being overlooked, the endless striving, the hurt I carried quietly like an heirloom. Somewhere along the way, I'd mistaken endurance for love. But standing there under that open sky, I understood that peace isn't something you win from others. It's something you decide to keep for yourself. A few weeks later, my parents visited again, this time without ceremony. They came on a Sunday afternoon just for coffee. My mother brought a basket of fresh scones, still warm, and my father insisted on fixing a loose shutter on the porch before sitting down. The visit was simple, almost ordinary, and maybe that was the point. We sat in the sunroom mug steaming between our hands. Conversation came easier. My father asked about the repairs to the greenhouse. My mother asked about the neighbors. No one mentioned the past. It hovered there like weather that had finally broken. Before leaving, my mother stood at the doorway and looked around. "You've made this place beautiful," she said quietly. "It feels like it knows who lives here." "Maybe it does," I said. She smiled small real, and for once there was no tension in her eyes. After they left, I walked out to the barn. The late afternoon light slanted through the boards, turning dust to gold. In one corner, a new batch of seedlings stretched toward the warmth. I knelt to check the soil, the scent of earth rising rich and alive. This place, this quiet work, it grounded me more than any approval ever could. That evening, I lit a single candle on the dining table and let the flame burn low while the wind moved softly against the windows. I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived under other people's expectations: dutiful daughter, quiet sister, invisible achiever, and felt a strange gratitude for them. They had carried me here. Sometimes healing isn't a grand event. It's just noticing that the ache has turned into air. Spring came early that year. The last of the snow melted into the soil, and small wildflowers began to push through the gravel along the drive. The house smelled of lemon oil and new beginnings. One morning, I hung a wooden sign on the gate that read, "Maple Hill, established 2019. I stepped back to look at it, feeling the kind of pride that doesn't need witnesses. Catherine visited again that summer. She brought her sketchbook full of landscapes and portraits, soft strokes that captured light the way memory does. We walked the property together, and she stopped often to draw the barn, the bend in the creek, the old maple that gave the house its name. Her laughter came easily, no longer edged with competition. When she left, she hugged me tightly. "You know," she said, "I finally understand what you were trying to build here." "What's that?" I asked. "A place where love isn't rationed," she said. "It just exists." I watched her car disappear down the lane, the dust lifting briefly before settling again. She was right. That was all I'd ever wanted for this house, this life to be a place where love simply lived unmeasured and free. That evening, I stood on the terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sun dip behind the ridge. The light lingered long after the sun was gone, stretching across the fields in soft amber ribbons. The world felt full and quiet all at once. I thought about the first morning I'd stood here months ago reading that message. "This year, just your sister." The memory no longer stung. It felt like another lifetime, someone else's pain. Now, when I think of family, I think of the laughter that filled this house in December, the warmth of forgiveness without demand, the sound of rain on the roof while people I love sit close enough to touch. I think of boundaries kept without anger and love given without cost. The wind picked up gently, brushing through the maples, carrying with it the scent of new leaves. I took a slow breath and closed my eyes. The world had not changed, but I had. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive, they fade because we finally let go. If this story touched something in you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you've ever had to rebuild peace from silence, share this story with someone who might need it. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep a little light for yourself.